I'd like to welcome Larry Yang, who is here at Garrison Institute to teach a program this weekend. Larry is trained as a psychotherapist and teaches meditation with a special emphasis on multicultural communities. He is a core teacher at Spirit Rock Meditation Center and at the East Bay Meditation Center in downtown Oakland. He is also a guiding teacher at the Insight community of the desert in Palm Springs, California. Larry has spent 6 months as a monastic in Thailand, and his website is larryyang.org. He has also started a blog on the Huffington Post entitled Being Kind in Unkind Times, reflecting on the 10,000 joys and the 10,000 sorrows that life challenges us with. So welcome, Larry.
Thanks for having me.
Could you just tell us a little bit about what brought you to Buddhism to begin with?
Well, let's see. Not unlike many young people growing up, I had some difficulties in my life, especially being a gay man of color and not really feeling like I belonged in many places in this world. I grew up in a pretty Caucasian suburb outside of Philadelphia. And it was really hard for me to reconcile my cultural experience. And so whether I was in high school or college, and what I did at the time, which was I guess in the late 60s, early 70s, is I turned to self-medicating that difficulty, that suffering, and became involved in a lot of drug and alcohol use. And it was during the period of my recovery from that those substances that, you know, just because you're off of those self-medications doesn't mean that your life is easy. And so in my therapy, the therapist said, you know, there's got to be some way for you to decrease your anxiety. And so one of the suggestions was meditation. And I just slowly got my way into really trying to, I didn't know about MBSR at the time, so I was just trying to discover my own way into just stress reduction. And, you know, if you had told me 15 years later I would be ordaining as a monastic in Thailand, I would have thought you were crazy at the time, but, you know, that's where the practice eventually led me.
Fascinating, thank you. I know that you are affiliated with the Insight Meditation Society. Could you just tell us a little something about the history and lineage of that organization? What centers are you affiliated with, and what types of programs do you teach?
Well, both Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, and Spirit Rock Meditation Center in Woodacre, California, are sort of the two flagship organizations that have really brought Vipassana practice, Theravadan practice, this lineage from Southeast Asia into North America, outside of the Thai and Burmese temples, so really into Western culture. And the senior teachers, IMS, is you know, Jack Kornfield and Joseph Goldstein, Sharon Salzberg. All of them studied in Southeast Asia and India and created over 30 years ago these practice centers that have really been important in grounding the experience of the Dharma in the West. And I think Spirit Rock is just celebrating its 25th anniversary this year. And so I've been fortunate to have practiced in both locations. Both locations have residential retreats that people are able to attend and really get a taste of how deeply the practice can go.
Thank you. In IMS, I don't know that much about it, but I've certainly heard about the Vipassana meditation practice as well as metta practice, and I wondered, are there other practices associated with this path And what are they, and how and when are they introduced?
Well, Vipassana, one of the translations is to see clearly, to really, as the mind begins to settle, you begin to gain insight as to what your life is like, what is really happening, what are the conditions of one's life. And that aspect of just being attentive, just paying attention, is one flavor of practice. There is also another formal practice of loving kindness, but these days many teachers are actually bringing them together, and how the aspect of just paying attention with tenderness is actually the experience of kindness as well. So they can be taught both as complementary practices or integrated practices. But the other view is it's not just those doors that this lineage of Buddhism offers. Really, what is said is that there are 84,000 doors into the path of freedom. And so there are practices of generosity, gratitude, patience, effort, determination, faith. All of these are viewed as practices. And so the invitation really is to find out what you're curious about, what interests you in particular, because the Dharma, I mean, one of the things I so appreciate and love about this practice is that it's holographic in a way, that you go through one practice that speaks to your heart and mind, but when you go through that door, you inevitably see all of the teachings. That is the nature of this path towards an awakened heart and mind, because it includes everything.
Yeah, thank you. I know, Larry, you have a special emphasis on multiculturalism in your teachings. Could you explain what you mean by that term?
Sure. Well, of course, it comes from my own experience. I mean, as I was saying, how I got into the practice, how the practice actually has given me freedom in my life. It's been really the freedom from suffering around the cultural experience of difference. And as I have practiced, as I have gotten to know more deeply what the significance of the door into freedom was through my cultural experience, I began to, as I began to read sort of the historical context of the teachings as well, I began to realize that culture as a component in the teachings is indispensable and inseparable from the teachings themselves. So, for example, the Buddha's teachings were given in a certain place and time in northeast India, and it has migrated through innumerable cultures: Central Asia, China, Japan, Southeast Asia, and into the West. Every time the Dharma has entered a new culture, it has changed that culture. But the forms in which one practices also get changed. So, for example, in China, the forms, it took almost 600 or 700 years, but the forms radically changed to make them culturally congruent. And this is actually in the Vinaya, the monastic code of the Buddha's monastic Sangha, that he gives permission for the Dharma to be taught in one's own language. And it's such an important teaching because in the Buddha's time, it was before the written language. So when you have the reference different language, you're also actually saying different culture. Every single language had a different culture at that time. And so using that template, that historical template of how the Dharma enters our lives through our cultural experience, I think in the West we have a tendency to really ignore culture and overlook its importance, because we go to that place of we're all one, we're all interconnected, and that is true. That is absolutely true. But in order to get to that place of feeling that interconnection and interrelatedness, we actually go through the differences. We don't ignore or go around. John Wellwood uses this phrase, spiritual bypass.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that is part of the collective unconscious that is being revealed by the need for different communities to have retreats that are specifically tailored to their cultural view and cultural experience, whether it's women's retreats or retreats for communities of color or the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community. All of these communities need their own reflection in the teachings and the stories that are told, that sometimes don't get articulated in what we might call mainstream retreats, or retreats that are primarily from the dominant cultural point of view. And so these culturally specific retreats have been such important doorways for people to get to know how the Dharma can actually provide freedom.
Thank you. That's very interesting. And speaking of the gay community, how can the heterosexual community support the gay community's spiritual practice? I always wonder what would be truly helpful. Does it make sense to bring attention to it, to sort of just kind of think more about what we have in common rather than what our differences are? I wondered if you might speak to that.
Well, it's interesting that you use the phrase pay attention.
Yeah.
Because paying attention is the aspect of mindfulness. And paying attention also, as I was saying earlier, the act of kindness. Because when we pay attention, the object of our attention feels loved and acceptance. We can say that on an interpersonal level or an inner level as we practice mindfulness, but we actually have to do that as communities too, because this is not just an internal practice. And so, as different communities' needs get articulated, whether again it's the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community or communities of color, as their needs arise for the mainstream culture, from the dominant culture, to pay attention and to validate and to witness and support these communities, is not just an act of consciousness, it's actually an act of love. And there is so much healing in that offering that I have found to be really supportive of not just the communities in question, the culturally specific communities, but there's a tremendous amount of healing that happens in the mainstream culture as well. That in a way, this is how we come together and become whole again. This is the way that we express our universality, because really these specific communities are looking, they're looking for the relevance to their experience, the relevance to their specific stories, the ways that they've maybe been marginalized. This is not unlike the needs of anyone coming into spiritual practice. So one of the examples that is ironic that I use is that when our most senior Western teachers who went to Asia and had these brilliant experiences that clearly they have developed, depth to teach from, came back to the United States, they didn't necessarily go to the existing Asian temples, whether they were Mahayana, Vajrayana, or Theravada. They didn't necessarily go to those temples to create communities and teach. They created their own centers. At least, especially in the Theravadan tradition, which is where I'm coming from, they created places like IMS and Spirit Rock, like we were talking about. Why did they do that? My sense is at least part of the reason is that they wanted to work with a community that they saw themselves reflected in. That the stories, the cultural forms in the existing temples weren't necessarily congruent with the mainstream culture. And so this is where, even in our differences, we're the same. Even in our differences, there is a universal pattern of how we are as humans. I think that's quite profound. Because if we can recognize that, if we can hold that larger picture, we can actually move through the differences, and that is how we exist together as connected beings. It's really a gift of this practice of awareness to constantly be seeing the larger picture of how our human relationships don't need to get caught in our differences, but we can actually celebrate them.
Thank you, that's beautiful. And I just, as a last question, I can't help asking about your time as a monastic. I was so curious about the fact that you had taken monk's vows for 6 months, and could you just tell us a little bit about what that experience was like for you?
Yeah, it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, at least in the conditions of my life with a family, with parents to take care of, with a spouse. And so it took about 5 years to orchestrate. And I spent 6 months as a monastic in a village monastery in Thailand. I had the privilege, really the privilege of traveling and visiting other monastic communities. And my intention, unlike some folks who ordain for an indefinite period of time, which is really quite a beautiful release and letting go into the practice, my intention was really to find what was truly relevant in this ancient lineage that has been supported by literally billions of practitioners over innumerable generations. What was relevant in our 21st century North American environments? And I had already begun to teach, and I really wanted to anchor what I was sharing with the direct experience of how grounded and ancient this tradition was. And to bridge, all of this generational support, and to bridge the time, and to bridge the human experience between, sort of our contemporary culture and, how it gets expressed with some of these, beautifully, again, I from my own experience, I experience these as universal teachings. They're not even within the monopoly of Buddhism or the Dharma. Really, they're the aspirations of any human heart, regardless of what spiritual tradition that you ascribe to. And it just so happens that this path resonates with this heart, and that's what I have this joy to offer.
Thank you.